Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gardening Green Expo 2024. The sponsors of the expo are the NSRWA, the Water Smart Program, and Kennedy's Country Gardens. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we will have a Q&A session after the presentation is done. And if you have a question to ask, you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little icon that says chat. You just type your question in there and then I'll read them at the end of the presentation. So now I would like to present Doug Tallamy.
Thank you. Okay. This is a brand new talk. So you are either a lucky audience or an unfortunate audience because I've never given it to anybody yet. So we'll see how it goes. I call it, I know you're very busy, but that's the title of endless emails that I get, people asking me questions that I answer. So before we start with those questions, let me just remind you that we are evolutionary guests on this planet, and our stay here is provisional. If we destroy our life support systems, our residency on the planet is going to be a short one. Now, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems, every person bears responsibility for taking care of those ecosystems. Now, fortunately, more and more people are understanding this message and accepting the responsibility. But that means they need a lot more knowledge to actually act on it. And for some reason, that people think that I can give them some of that knowledge. So many of them are asking me for it. And Albert Einstein is guilting me into actually answering those emails. He says, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. So that's what this talk's all about. The people are asking me questions, have heard my talks, they have read my books, and they still have very good questions. So that is going to be the topic of my next book. It'll be out in March of next year. It's about 400 of those questions. We're going to talk about 25 of them tonight, but it'll get us started anyway. And one question I get quite a bit is how I got interested in conservation. And that actually started very on. First of all, I was born loving nature, so I was attracted to it wherever I saw it. But when I was in third grade, we moved to a new development called Oak Park in Berkeley Heights, New Jersey. And it was called Oak Park because oaks are what they took down to create the development. Well, we lived in a circle and they built the houses from right to left. So our house was the first house to be built on the circle. That means the lot to the left of us was the last house to be built. And it was undeveloped for a full year after we moved in. And there was a little pond just like this on that lot. So that was my first real exposure to nature. I spent a lot of time at that pond. In the spring, toads came and sang. I thought that was really cool. And then the males hugged the females. That was cool too. And then, of course, the females laid eggs and the males fertilized those eggs. And that got the whole thing started because those eggs turned into pollywogs, which after a couple of weeks in the water developed into little toads. And just before they come out, they've got a little bit of a tail that's shortening rapidly, and they use that to spur their growth. But they are tiny little things. I mean, he looks big now, but when you put him on your hand, it is a tiny little guy. And that is what was escaping from the pond. One day when I was sitting there watching, all the toads came coming out, thousands of them. But it was the same time that the bulldozer came and buried the whole pond. Buried the toads. It would have buried me too. I don't think he even saw me, but I did run away. But it made an impression on me that we needed to save nature as many places as we could. Now, I could have just walked right back into my backyard, gotten a shovel, and dug a new pond. I bet you my parents would have helped me do it. But it never occurred to me to do that. It was a standard idea of conservation. We've got to save nature before people destroy it. We've got to go to pristine areas and save it. Restoring nature after it's been destroyed just did not occur to me. And I'm sorry that it did not. But it set me on the path of conservation. I've been conservation minded ever since that happened in third grade. Another question, why can't insects quickly adapt to non-native plants? I get this one quite a bit, and it's a good question. because people will correctly point out that insects have the ability to adapt to lots of things very quickly, particularly insecticides. Insecticide resistance is a big problem in agriculture. Well, this is how insecticide resistance happens. When you spray a field, for example, there are always a couple of, let's say these are moths, there's a couple of moths that are going to have resistant genes in them already. So the spray will kill all the moths in the field except the few that have resistant genes. Those are the ones that will mate and create a new generation, and there'll be a whole lot more resistant genes in that generation. Then the next generation, after another round of spraying, will be even more resistance, and finally everybody will be resistant. And that happened in just 4 generations, very, very fast. Well, why doesn't that happen when a new host plant appears? Why aren't the insects adapting to that? The simple answer is it's far more complicated. You have to think about what it takes for an insect to recognize and use a new host plant. Insects do this primarily through chemical signals. So for example, when a butterfly lands on a leaf, it has to decide, is this an appropriate host plant? And it does that. First of all, it finds the plant with sensors on its antennae. And then it evaluates the plant once it's landed on it with sensors on its tarsi, on its feet. So it's smelling the plant in the air with its antennae, and it's smelling the hydrocarbons that are on the leaf, the waxy coating of the leaf, to determine whether it's the right species. Before it actually lays an egg, of course, there are those receptors on the antennae. There are also receptors on the ovipositor at the end of the abdomen. And in order to actually lay an egg on this new plant, you'd require a mutation in the genes controlling those antennal receptors, in the genes controlling the tarsal receptors, and finally in the genes controlling the, they're the tarsal receptors, the ovipositor receptors. So there's 3 forms of confirmation to make sure that that butterfly is on the right plant. Once it lays its egg, of course, the little guy hatches out. Its very first meal is the eggshell itself, because it's full of protein. But then they have to deal with this plant. Now, if they're on the correct host plant, there's no problem. They recognize it as food. They can eat it. They are physiologically adapted to it. But if it's a new, novel host plant, one they've never seen before in evolutionary time, they're going to have adaptations that detoxify the chemical defenses of this plant, and also that signal that it is the correct plant to start eating. So just to summarize, you've got to have a whole lot of simultaneous adaptations to allow an insect to switch hosts. It's got to be able to detect that plant among an array of hundreds of other species. That happens mostly with the antennae. Then it's got to accept the chemical signals of the waxes on the leaf itself with its tarsi, and also its ovipositor. The hatchling has to accept the new taste of the plant, and it also has to be able to physiologically detoxify the plant's defensive chemistry. So host switches happen, but not very often. It's very hard to get all those things to line up at the same time. Let's use the monarch butterfly as an example. It, of course, is adapted to milkweeds. Well, black swallowwort is a plant in the milkweed lineage. It's not in the same genus, but it is closely enough related to milkweeds that it gives off chemical signals that monarchs detect mistakenly as milkweeds. So they actually land on the plant. The chemical signals are still consistent with milkweeds, and occasionally they will lay an egg on it. And that's where the system falls apart, because the young monarch butterfly is unable to detoxify the compounds that are in black swallowwort. So we introduced as an ornamental back in 1854, that's 170 years ago. The monarch is still unable to use it as a host plant. The final bit of adaptations required to make that a host switch have not occurred yet. Okay, question 3. You claim it takes thousands of years for insects to adapt to new host plants, but some other entomologists disagree and point to several species of butterflies that now breed successfully on non-native plants. How do you explain that? Well, that's another good question. There are 2 ways that insects adapt new host plants. Host switching, and that's what we just talked about, very hard, very difficult for that to happen. or host range expansion. That's not hard. And the reason it's not hard is because insects already have the adaptations required to use a new host in host range expansion. So when I say it takes eons to adapt to a new host, I'm talking about host switching, not host range expansion. Most of the cases of native insects reproducing on non-native plants are examples of host range expansion. So the big difference here is that host range expansion does not require any new adaptations. The insect already has all of the adaptations required to use this new host plant. Typically, the new host plant is in the same lineage as the host that the insect is already adapted to, which is why it doesn't need any new adaptations to use it. The black swallowtail is a very common example. It, of course, is a specialist on plants in the carrot family. It can eat all of them. So when we import Queen Anne's lace, carrots, or dill, or parsley, black swallowtails already have the adaptations necessary to use those plants. If we simply compare go to the literature and look at host records and compare the number of caterpillars, lepidopteran species that are using native plants versus non-native plants, and this data set is from woody plants in the mid-Atlantic state. But it shows that when you have a non-native plant, there's a 90% reduction in the ability of our insects to be able to use them. So even with host range expansion, very few insects are able to use these non-native plants, even when they're in the same lineage. Question 4, what is carrying capacity? I use that term in my talks quite often, but I don't usually explain what it is. Well, it's the number of individuals of a particular species that can be supported sustainably. Sustainably means kind of forever, without degrading the resource base. In other words, that individual can thrive in this habitat without causing other species to decline because it's not using up its resource base. What is the resource base? Well, carrying capacity for animals comes from plants because it's plants that is capturing energy. They're capturing energy from the sun, combining it with carbon dioxide from the air, water from the ground, and through the miraculous phytochemistry we call photosynthesis, it produces oxygen. And now the energy from the sun is tied up in the carbon bonds of simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So plants are making the food. They are the species that are determining what the carrying capacity for animals are. A useful analogy might be comparing carrying capacity to our bank accounts, our savings accounts. The amount of plant life in an ecosystem could be considered the principle of an ecological bank account. Now, that principle is going to generate interest. So the energy fixed by those plants is going to be the interest created by our ecological bank account. And that is what plant or animal life is going to live off of if you remain below the carrying capacity. So an animal population can grow and cycle beneath the carrying capacity essentially forever because they're never reducing the principal in the bank account. The bank account is producing the energy that these animals use, and it can go on happily forever. But what if you exceed the carrying capacity or something else reduces the principal in your bank account? Well, then, of course, it's going to produce far less interest, and any animal population will have to be there in far fewer numbers. So that, in a nutshell, is what carrying capacity is. Question 5, I live in an area with lots of Lyme disease. Several websites suggest keeping large lawns because they're not attractive to ticks. The sites also say I should get rid of brush piles because ticks love them. How can I contribute to local ecosystems without getting Lyme disease? Another good question. Well, let's think about what deer ticks actually need to survive in our landscapes. Deer ticks do not eat native plants. They do not eat leaf litter. They do not eat brush piles. They eat blood. So what they need is mammal hosts. They also need high humidity, and that's why plant life and brush life is a good place for them to hide. Well, the mammal blood that they're eating, as the typical mammals in our landscapes, are white-tailed deer. They are an essential part of the Lyme disease black-legged tick or deer tick life cycle. And another major feature of that life cycle is typically white-footed mice There are other mammals that can serve that way too. So some people say, well, we should get rid of all the mice and that'll break the cycle. But white-footed mice and other rodents in our ecosystems are essential components of terrestrial ecosystems. If we got rid of our small mammals, we get rid of all of our hawks and our owls and our black snakes, all the other things that depend on them. The problem is right here. We have way too many deer. And that is why Lyme disease has become a real problem. When I was growing up, of course, there were very few deer where there was no Lyme disease. I never saw a deer tick, and we ran around the woods all the time. So now with an overabundance of deer, we've got a problem. How can we control deer? I'm not going to dwell on this. This is, of course, very controversial. You can put predators back. You can hire sharpshooters to reduce the deer in your neighborhood. It's very expensive. They'll get about a third of them, and then they'll increase right away. So they have to keep coming back, and people don't usually do that. Bernd Blassie at Cornell is suggesting we change the rules and start market hunting again. Look at how well it got rid of those pesky bison and the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet and all the other things. Market hunting really does work, but we need to change our hunting rules. But without doing that, there's a good way to reduce the infectivity rates on your property. What you want to do is increase alternate hosts for those ticks, because many of those hosts are dead-end hosts. The Lyme, the Borrelia, the disease itself cannot replicate in many of those small mammal hosts. So if we increase the population of alternate hosts, things like skunks and chipmunks and coons, that's a possum, that's a coon, foxes, all of these things on our property, most of them are dead-end hosts, and the chances of you running into a tick that actually has a high load of the disease are greatly reduced. So here's a good example. In the southeast, there are a lot of deer and there are a lot of deer ticks, but there's very little Lyme disease in humans. Why? Because there's also a lot of lizards, things like the blue-tailed skink and anoles, a number of these things. And these guys are dead-end hosts. So the ticks get on these vertebrates, and they are siphoned off. The percentage of ticks that are actually carrying viable disease loads is greatly reduced. And by the way, ticks don't run after you. They do something we call questing. They crawl to the top of a little piece of vegetation, and they put their little legs out, and when you walk by, they grab on. So design a landscape where you can walk in your yard without brushing up against vegetation. This is a perfect use of lawn, by the way. I talk all the time about reducing the area of lawn. Well, it's still very functional. It's the best place to walk. It's a cue for care. This is a very attractive landscape. It's got a lot of other plants in it. So particularly during the months of high infectivity, which are May and June, it's a good idea to stay on the mowed areas of your yard and not venture into these places. And then, later on in the year, infectivity levels drop and you can do that. So swaths of grass is a good idea. You don't need acres of it, though. Question 6, plants and animals have always moved around the planet, so the arrival of new species on our shores is a natural process. So what's the big deal? If the new species are more fit than the species already here, then they deserve to replace them. Well, there's a lot of misconceptions in this question. First of all, plants and animals have always moved around the planet. Yes, but at a very slow rate. The rate at which we're moving plants and animals now is thousands, probably millions of times faster than what happened in the evolutionary past. So yes, movement is normal, but the rates of movement that we are moving plants and animals around is not normal. What's the big deal if they are more fit? Well, are they more fit? That's been the party line, is that, well, these guys are highly competitive. This is a White Clay Creek State Park near me, and every bit of green you're looking at is an invasive plant from Asia. These are all escapees from our gardens. About 30% of the vegetation, in this state park are now invasive species. I took this picture in March when plants from Asia leaf out before plants from North America. So you can see it is a huge load. And you might conclude, well, they're displacing our native plants, so they are much more fit. But back to those deer. They're not more fit. It's just that the deer don't like them. The deer like our native plants, just like our insects like our native plants. So they eat the young oaks and the cherries and all the other things that we ought to have in our landscapes. And they don't eat the autumn olive and the bush honeysuckle and the barberry and the burning bush and all the other invasives that are out there. So of course, that's all that's left. It's not that they're more fit, it's that the deer are tipping the competitive balance against our native plants. So another reason to reduce the number of deer in our landscapes. This, by the way, is my front yard. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think there's an 8th one back there. We got a lot of deer, so I get it. I went to the Great Smoky Mountains in spring of last year. And this is what the understory looked like. And I hadn't seen an understory like this in a long time. So I asked the guide I was with, how do you control your deer? And he said, we don't control our deer. I said, well, how can you possibly have an understory like this if you don't control your deer? He said, well, we have black bears, we've got bobcats, and we've got coyotes. They control our deer. So that's an example of putting the predators back. Now, they don't have any wolves, but it's enough to have a healthy forest like this. Most of these plants here are young trees of what will become the canopy trees. So if a tree falls over, you've got young canopy trees to replace them. This is a picture from my yard. We have no understory. The deer have destroyed it. This is all Japanese stiltgrass. It's the only thing the deer don't eat. When these trees mature and die, there's nothing to replace them unless I actively plant them and protect them from the deer. So overbrowsing by deer inhibits recruitment into our forest, and it's another huge problem. Okay, question 7. What about the risks of bringing nature into our everyday spaces? Isn't interacting with nature dangerous? Well, our ability to assess risk is really poor. Here are some of the actual danger points we have in our lives. So West Nile virus, it's real, 130 people killed per year throughout the entire country. Only 2 are killed by snake bites. Alcohol kills 75,000 people. Melanoma, in other words, sunbathing, almost 8,000 deaths per year. 76,000 new cases per year. So this is increasing. Car crashes kill 44,000 people. Child overheating in cars, 550 deaths a year. Dogs are killing, our man's best friend, killing 20 to 30 of us every year. Falling, 20,000 a year. Overdose is the big one. Drug problems, 100 and almost 110,000 deaths per year. Texting kills over 3,000 people per year. Autoerotic asphyxiation, 600 deaths per year. Hot dogs, killing 70 people a year. Lightning kills 51. High school football kills 20. Vending machines falling over on us kills 13. Toasters, we put our forks in the toasters, 370 deaths per year. Flat screen TVs falling off the wall kills 41 of us. Selfies, 379 people killed by selfies. Can you guess how many people were killed by native plant gardening last year? I'll leave that one to you to figure out. Question 8, should we kill invasive species? Do we have the ethical right to decide what plant lives or dies? Okay, now we get into ethics. It'd be hard to find someone who did not believe that humans are superior beings and therefore we are more important than any other species. So if there's a conflict, we're going to win. That's pretty standard thinking, but I can guarantee you lions feel the same way. So do weevils, so do dung beetles, so do rattlesnakes. Every creature on the planet feels like it has the moral right to be here, even if it conflicts with somebody else. The reality is, even those who question our inherent right to manage invasive species make decisions about what lives and what dies every single day. We just don't think about it. Every time you select a non-native species over a native plant, you're deciding whether the chickadee in your yard is going to be able to feed its babies or watch them starve to death because there aren't enough caterpillars. This is crepe myrtle, not making any caterpillars. If we maintain acres of lawn, we're deciding whether or not hundreds of species of native plants and thousands of the animals that depend on those plants are going to be able to live in this space. Every time we hire a mosquito fogger, we're sentencing not just a few mosquitoes, but monarchs, all the pollinators, caterpillars, the bird food, we're sentencing them to death. And we're not controlling the mosquitoes when we do that. So by not controlling invasives, we're condemning entire food webs to death. So we have to make that decision. You have to decide which is better. But in either case, things are going to die. Question 9, why do you only focus on moths? Aren't butterflies important too? Well, butterflies are beautiful, and of course they're important, but moths are more important. Butterflies are bad-tasting, day-flying moths. Their phylogeny comes right out in the middle of moths. And because they don't taste very good, they're not contributing a lot to local food webs. For every species of butterfly that's out there, there are 19 species of moths, and that is what's running our food web. So I focus on them because they're ecologically so important. They are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. And that's why Dan Jansen calls moths the meat and potatoes of terrestrial food webs. They're essential. But I like them because they're also very cool. We've got gorgeous ones like the Madagascar moon moth. We've got moths that look like a rhinoceros. That's a brown rhinoceros. That's a yellow one. We've got moths that look like fish. I have not photoshopped any of these guys, by the way. Moths that look like algae, moths that look like rocket ships. We've got moths that look like stealth bombers, moths that look like lichens, a lot like lichens, moths that look like bird poop. We've got moths that look like the flowers that they eat. When I say moths, we're talking about the caterpillars of those moths. Or they look like the pine needles that they eat. There's a caterpillar there and a caterpillar there. They blend in really well. We've got moths that look like leaves, and we got moths that really look like leaves. This is a species from Japan. It is on my bucket list. We've got moths that look like the seed heads that they're eating. There's a caterpillar wound up in there. You would never see that. We've got moths that look like seeds. We've got moths that look like sticks. We've got, well, caterpillars that look like sticks, and we've got adult moths that look like sticks. Actually, quite a few species of them. Most of the sphinx moths look like jet planes. We've got moths that look like clowns. We've got big moths. We've got tiny moths. That's a pinhead there, and that's one of the moths on my property. We've got beautiful moths, and we've got dull moths. We've got moths that are startling in their effect when they spread their wings. We've got two-headed moths. And I've told that to people, and they believe me. That's actually a male and a female mating. But moths that are cryptic, blending in very well. We got moths that blow up their prothorax and look an awful lot like snakes. This is actually a sphinx moth. These are the legs down here. He turns upside down. It's incredible mimicry. More mimicry. We've got moths that look like yellow jackets, moths that look like beetles, moths that look like jewels. And we've got moths that look like that. So who wouldn't want to study moths? Do honeybees compete with native bees? I get this question a lot these days, and I wish I didn't, because beekeeping is essential for a number of forms of our agriculture, and it's a great hobby too. We've got a lot of enthusiasts keeping bees. But let's look at the numbers. We're scientists. We've got to look at the numbers here. Honeybees are extreme generalists. A single honeybee hive can house up to 30,000 bees. So there's a lot of bees in a single hive. The honeybees can forage 2 miles from their hive, so they're covering a huge area. That means a single hive could potentially compete with native bees over 8,000 acres of land. Also, beekeepers supplement their hives with sugar, so that even when flower density is very low, the populations of honeybees are very high. As of April 2022, there were 2.92 million hives in the US, which means honeybees have saturated the area of continental US 11.5 times. Now, let's assume native bee populations are near their carrying capacity. In other words, the populations are at the size that the environment can support. You cannot add 30,000 bees per hive to an area like that. It's already saturated with native bee abundance without degrading the resources for those bees. So it's a sad fact, but it's one that we need to think about, because we've got almost 4,000 species of native bees, and they are all in decline. Another question. Privet flowers are good sources of honey and pollen for honeybees. If we remove privet is invasive species, of course, from our natural areas as part of our fight against those invasive species, won't honeybees suffer? Privets, actually, we've got 9 species of privet in the US. They are all highly invasive. In Alabama alone, one species, the Chinese privet, covers 1 million acres. So they are everywhere. And when they cover an area, they push out the native plants. Well, privet blooms for about a week. So my question is, what are honeybees and all the other native bee species that need forage going to use for forage? By forage, I mean those flowering plants. What are they going to use for forage the other 51 weeks of the year? Because remember, the privet has pushed out the other flowering plants that would support both the honeybee and our native bees. And that's why I say that privet is not good for honeybees, and removing it will only help our bee populations. Question 12, oaks are dying right and left. Yes, they are. And as we cut them down, should we leave the logs on our property or to prevent infection of other trees, or can we leave them as coarse woody debris? It's another good question. The answer is you can leave them. So the diseases that we have, things like bacterial leaf scorch, this is bacterial leaf scorch. We've got oak wilt, we've got sudden oak death syndrome. Those diseases are spread when the tree is still alive. The spores of the disease are active as it's killing the tree. They do not remain in dead wood. So downed wood, it's called coarse woody debris, is a very valuable habitat, and we should leave as much of it as we can. You know, we're neatniks. We'd like to clean up our forests and get rid of all this stuff, but so many things depend on this downed wood. So if you pull apart a log any time of the year, even in the wintertime, it's going to be filled with columbella, like this little sminthurid, or centipedes, and centipedes, and millipedes, and the larvae of click beetles. They all live in dead logs. The larvae of fire color beetles, many beetle larvae live in dead logs, including a number of species of scarabs. They develop in coarse woody debris. So do cerambycid longhorn beetles. And if anybody splits wood, you run into their larvae. They're called flat-headed borers. They're very common in our downed logs. Leucanid stag beetles, and some of these species are endangered at this point, live in downed logs. Basalid best beetles have social structures in our downed logs. Buprested wood, metallic wood boring beetles live in those logs. Several species of butterflies overwinter as adults in coarse woody debris that's on the ground. Things like mourning cloaks and commas and question marks all live in spaces like that. And then, of course, we have our carpenter bees. We've got large carpenter bees, and we've got small species of carpenter bees there in that wood. You know, when we clean up all the coarse woody debris, where are the carpenter bees going to go? They're going to go to the soffits on our house. They're going to go to our porch railings, and then people get upset. So keep some of that coarse woody debris around, and they will breed in that. And then we have ants, carpenter ants. Carpenter ants don't eat wood. They hollow out wood that's been damaged or is rotting, and they live within that. And then they often forage in your house. You think you've got them living in your house, but they're usually living in a tree or a dead snag in your backyard. And it's a good thing we have carpenter ants, because we wouldn't have pileated woodpeckers if we didn't. Pileated woodpeckers feed their young carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers if you don't have any carpenter ants, and you won't have carpenter ants unless you have those downed trees that support them. Question 13, what's the best way to plant and propagate milkweed? Well, unfortunately, milkweed seeds, that's the worst way to propagate milkweed. They make a lot of seeds. It's easy to gather them up, but many of them are infertile. It's often up to 90% of them are infertile. So you're disappointed at the rate of germination for a lot of these milkweed species. The very best way is to dig up an existing milkweed plant and divide the stoloniferous root system. So what they do is they grow laterally underground, and then they send up ramets. That's why when you look at a milkweed patch, it can actually be a single plant that has gone out in all different directions. Cut this lateral root, this stoloniferous root, into maybe 2-inch sections, plant it about an inch under the surface of the soil, and it will germinate or generate a new plant, a new ramette. And it's fast. It's a very easy way to do it. I discovered this by accident. I had some milkweed growing up in my vegetable garden, and this was back in the days when I actually used a rototiller. So I rototilled the whole thing, meaning I chopped up these roots into many tiny pieces. So I took what was about 3 milkweed plants and turned it into about 50 milkweed plants just by doing that. Speaking of monarchs, is rearing monarchs good or bad? Well, it depends on your intentions and how you're doing it. There are really 2 reasons that people rear monarchs. They rear them for fun and for educational purposes, or for conservation. So when you rear them for educational purposes, there's a number of lessons that you can impart. You can teach kids about the different insect life stages, what complete metamorphosis is, egg, larva, pupa, and an adult. You can teach them about host plant specialization. You're not going to have monarchs if you don't have the one thing that they eat, and that is milkweeds. These are valuable lessons. So actually, I support that. Rearing for conservation is a different issue. Then you're rearing as many monarchs as you can. And 2 problems here. First of all, when you crowd them, it's very easy for them to pass diseases back and forth. And also, you're removing them from natural selection in the field. What you're selecting for here are monarchs that are good at surviving in a crowded situation like this in containers. But they're removed from the pressures that they have to experience in the field. And that, of course, is not going to be good. So yeah, there you go. The disease transmission and removing them from natural selection. If you really want to help monarchs, the best way is to provide what they need, and that is milkweed. That is large patches of milkweed, not 1 or 2 ramettes here or there, but a whole patch. And a patch like this will support as many monarchs as you have. Believe me, they're never going to be able to defoliate it. So this is the best way if you're really into monarch conservation. Question 14, the monarchs on my milkweed keep disappearing. Just when they get big, they disappear. I get this question about the black swallowtails, about a number of different butterflies. Now, I assume the birds are eating them, but I thought the monarch caterpillars tasted bad, so I'm confused. What is stealing my monarchs? Well, the answer is nothing stealing your monarchs. Butterflies pupate typically off of their host plant. So here's a monarch chrysalis, and it's attached to a blade of grass. This is from my yard. It's not attached to a milkweed plant. I have never found a chrysalis on a milkweed plant. And the reason is they want to get away from the plant because their natural enemies find the chrysalis by finding the milkweed plant. They're attracted to the plant first, and they look all around to see if there's any monarchs there. So monarchs and other butterflies, moths, lots of things will leave their host plant before they pupate, before they form their chrysalis, and do it someplace else. This is the pipevine swallowtail again on I think this is goldenrod, but it's not on pipevine. As a matter of fact, we have a sliding glass door that leads out to our back where the pipevine is. And I found a pipevine swallowtail chrysalis hanging from one of our picture frames on the wall in our house. So that little guy had crawled all the way up our stairs into our house and formed its chrysalis on our window. So it's getting away from its host plant so that it's not attacked by its natural enemies. So again, bottom line is nothing's taking your monarchs. They're simply forming a chrysalis someplace where you're not looking for them. Question 15. What are those orange and black bugs on my milkweed? Should I kill them? You know, I get this all the time. Why is our default option to kill them right away? I would say, should I leave them alone? Yes, leave them alone. You've got several things that are eating milkweed, and most of them are orange and black. Milkweed, remember, is a toxic plant. It tastes bad. So if you can eat milkweed, you taste bad, and it's a good idea to advertise that in what we call aposematic coloration. Orange and black is the universal aposematic coloration. Birds that eat insects, mammals that eat insects know that, and they won't eat something that's orange and black. So this is the large milkweed bug, Onchopeltis fasciatus. It can be common on our milkweeds once they reach the stage where they form their pods, because these guys are seed eaters. They're only eating the seeds. They don't eat the plants. These are adults, of course. These are nymphs of the same species, and they're eating seeds as well. The seeds are lined up inside this pod. So these guys push their mouth parts through the pod and suck on the seed that's in the pod. So there's two reasons that they're doing this gregariously. And by gregariously, I mean together. One is that it forms what we call an aposematic warning signal that's very noticeable. When you're all grouped together, it sends this message, we taste bad. It's easier to see, so it's easier for predators to avoid them. But feeding facilitation is also one of the reasons they're all gathered up together like this. Remember, these guys have sucking mouth parts, and they're eating a solid. How do they do that? They can't suck the seed through their mouth part. Well, what they do is they digest it externally. So they actually spit on the seed and digest it outside of their body, and then they suck up all the material that's left. And when you do that as an aggregation like this, you're able to digest a lot more seeds, and it's easier for each individual to be able to eat when you're grouped up like this. That's called feeding facilitation. But people get upset, oh, it's going to kill all my milkweed seeds. No, they only get the very first layer of seeds that are in this pod. And if you've ever looked in a milkweed pod, there's layer and layer and layer of seeds out there. So they're part of the natural fauna that's associated with milkweeds. And by the way, these guys display the exact same migration pattern that monarchs do. They don't go to Mexico, but they do fly south in the fall, all the way down to the Gulf states, and that's where they overwinter because there are milkweeds making pods down in the Gulf states, and then they fly back up in the springtime. The other species that's black and orange that's very common on milkweeds is the milkweed tussock moth. And they can be there in big aggregations. It's how they overcome the sticky latex sap. So when they're young, they're not black and orange. But as they get older, they turn black and orange, and they always feed together. They're actually quite beautiful creatures. But people worry, well, they're gonna kill my milkweed. You know, they do get numerous, and they can strip 2 or 3 of your milkweed ramets. But don't worry, it's got that underground root system. It's not going to kill it. They will come back. This is what the adult looks like. It's a drab moth. You're not likely to notice it at all. Question 16, could you provide your thoughts on the use of southern, more heat-tolerant species within our more northern parts of the U.S.? So we're talking about assisted migration with climate change. Should we be moving plants up from the south? I'm not a fan of assisted migration, and this is why. This is the jet stream. And in the old days, before climate change, it was much better behaved. It would dip here and there, but you didn't have wild dips. And above the jet stream, it was usually pretty cold. And below the jet stream, it was more mild, particularly in the wintertime. Under the climate change scenario, though, you get these wild swings of the jet stream. So you get unusual heat, even in the northern areas when it's way up here. But when it dips down, then this becomes really cold. So it can dip down all the way into Mexico. You remember the big freezes that went right through Texas a couple of years ago, killed even many of our native plants down here because it got unusually cold. So this is a feature of climate change. We don't have a gentle warming. We've got wild swings in temperatures that average out to be warmer over the long run, but we still have cold snaps. So if you bring plants up from the south, many of them aren't going to make it. Another reason I'm not a fan of assisted migration is that we don't want to move plants out of their native range because then you're disassociating them with the animals that they co-evolved with. Remember, our plants are supporting the local food web. And if you remove them from that food web, wherever you take them to, those animals are probably not adapted to using those plants, which means they become decorations, just like a plant from Asia. Question 17. What do you think of No-mow May? Well, not much. It's a good intention, but ecologically, it's a bad idea. When you don't mow turf grass, you get tall turf grass. That's exactly what happened in this house. They had a perfect lawn. And then I guess they went into foreclosure and the people just moved out. Nobody took care of it. So it got long. But tall turf grass doesn't support pollinators any better than short turf grass does. And if you have an ugly lawn that's full of dandelions and clover and other things, then it will. If you don't mow it, yes, it will support pollinators for the month of May. But then I presume you're going to mow it in June. So what it's like bait and switch. You call the pollinators in, and then in June you remove all the resources that they need. Pollinators don't live for just a month. So it's much better to have no-mow areas that you never mow. Create a pollinator garden, an attractive one like this, where you've got a number of different flowering plants that are going to bloom on a sequence from April all the way through the end of October. It's a real challenge to make a garden like this, but that is what the pollinators need, not just 1 month of not mowing your grass. How should I remove lawn? So let's say you want to create a pollinator garden like this and it's lawn right now. How can you remove that grass? Well, what you have to do is kill the root systems of your turf grass because turf grass is a highly competitive plant. It is going to outcompete anything you plant there. So you've got to kill the root systems. And there's a couple of ways to do that. What works would be to smother that turf grass. You can use black plastic, you can use cardboard, you can use builder's paper. And of course, the professionals use herbicide because they can't wait months to do this. What doesn't work is digging up your yard and then flipping it over and hoping that kills the grass. It really won't. Most of the root system will survive and it'll just start growing again. Or cutting it really short and seeding over it. That doesn't work either. The grass is going to recover and it's going to outcompete anything you seeded in. And some people simply dig up all the grass and carry it away. But then you're removing a whole bunch of topsoil as well. And you don't want to do that. You want to keep that topsoil, very valuable stuff. So here's black plastic spread out over a pretty big area. This works, but it literally takes months to kill that grass. And you can't have any holes in here. You can't allow the grass to get sunlight anywhere because it will survive. This guy's using cardboard. I've done this myself, but notice you can even see it here. Cardboard always has plastic tape on it. And the 1 year I did this, I was pulling up tape for about 4 or 5 years after that. So I'm not a big fan of cardboard. This is builder's tape. It's a terrible web pictures of the gray builder's tape. But if you've ever been in a new construction house, they've got this spread on the floor. This is actually a really good idea. You put some mulch over the top of it, then you can plant right through it because it just dissolves. You never have to pull it up. So you're going to smother the grass, but you can start planting a little bit sooner this way. It's also very cheap. If you decide to use herbicides, you can use an herbicide that kills everything, or you can use an herbicide that is grass specific. It focuses only on grasses, and there's a lot of them. What do you think of Miyawaki forests? Miyawaki, the Miyawaki method is to create what we call tiny forests. You take an area and you crowd plants, really crowd, just like this, into that area. It was designed by a Japanese man named Miyawaki, and for actually more tropical settings where plants are very good at growing very densely. But we're using it in temperate zone situations now. And often in urban areas. So there's a number of pluses here. Look what's happening here. This is a community effort. You're actually getting people involved in conservation, working together, getting to know each other, usually taking degraded land and making it somewhat productive wherever you create one of these Miyawaki forests. There are advantages and there are disadvantages. The advantage is you're going to plant small plants, which means costs are low. That's great. The tinier the plant, the better. And you're going to plant them very densely, which means weeding is reduced. There's not going to be space for weeds to come in there. Because when you have a planting, typically invasive plants are trying to get in there right away. So it reduces weeding. It creates high plant diversity, which in theory should create high insect diversity. So there should be lots of bird food, at least for a while. This is kind of hypothetical because nobody's measured it yet. I actually have a grad student who's thinking about doing that. Disadvantages are that these plants will move through succession, and the ones that grow fastest are going to start to outcompete the other ones. They will shade them out. And in 20 years, you're only going to have a few plants in that space. So some people say, why don't you just plant those few plants originally, and maybe they'll even grow a little faster. Well, you have a lot of weeding, you got a lot of mowing, you got to, and the plants you plant are probably going to be more expensive. People always want big plants. So, and you're losing all of these advantages when you do that. So in the beginning, when I first started thinking about this, I said, well, gee, in the end, it's only going to be a few plants. So why are we doing this? There are good reasons to do it. And now I'm actually a fan. Question 20. I often find the expense of purchasing native plants is out of my budgets. Do you have any suggestions? Yeah, try something that we call addition by subtraction. It's actually, I got that from Rick Dark. He suggests this all the time. So rather than actually planting our native plants, let them come in naturally. And all you worry about is removing the plants that you don't want. That's not trivial because these days with our invasive species, there's a lot of plants we don't want. But the animals around us, the things like these little squirrels. I'm having a brain freeze here. And of course, the gray squirrels. He's moving a black walnut. Chipmunks, our blue jays, ants. There are a lot of things that are moving native plant seeds around, and that's how they colonize. So if you simply remove the bad guys, here's a burning bush coming in, especially at this stage. You got to be vigilant. You can pull it out easily. Then the plants that you leave, here's a burning bush that's not red. You got to be careful. You can keep the bad guys out and let the good guys come in. You also can shift the concentration, particularly of native grasses, towards the warm season bunch grasses by changing your mowing schedule. This is what Larry Weiner suggests. If you mow heavily in the spring, you're keeping your cool season European grasses down, and then don't mow the rest of the year for a couple of years in a row. That encourages the warm season bunch grasses that will come in and do well in the summertime and outcompete the turf grass. So with those methods, you're actually shifting towards a higher percentage of native plants without actually buying any plants at all. Question 21, I've been told that all animals or all annuals are weeds. They have little value for wildlife, and they should always be replaced by perennials. Is this true? No, it's not true. I don't know where that came from. The notion that annuals are just placeholders for the more valuable perennials I think it's preposterous. There's an awful lot of things to depend on our annuals, like our hummingbirds depending on jewelweed. It's an extremely valuable resource for them from August right through September. Then there's countless specialist moths that are on our annuals. So things like the beautiful painted Shinia depends entirely on Indian blanket. The goldenrod hooded owlet depends on horseweed. These are annuals. People don't like them, but those insects do. The goldenrod stowaway, it's a misnomer. It depends on Biden's aristosa, an annual. It's a beautiful annual, actually. Even plants that we don't like much, like ragweed, support lots of things, like the common spraguea. It's a beautiful moth. The ragweed flower moth. We can call it ambrosia, and that makes it sound better. But annuals have a very important role in our ecosystems. They're colonizing earlier. They grow quickly, and they're step one in succession. So you certainly don't want to get rid of them. Do you have a succinct statement to submit to my HOA who recently cited me for growing weeds? Well, let's try this. We humans face life-threatening crises from climate change and biodiversity loss. Reducing the area of lawn and using more productive native plants in our landscapes addresses both of these crises. This can be done tastefully, without the use of chemicals, and without reducing property values. It is the future of landscaping. Question 22. My HOA believes native plantings reduce property values. How can I convince them otherwise? Well, you can provide a good model, a good example of why that's not going to happen. First of all, our native plants can be used in formal designs that aren't going to reduce property values. This is a design by Lynn O'Shaughnessy. You don't get more formal than that. Every plant in that landscape is a native plant, and that's not going to reduce property values. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe all the time. Europeans love them, so we can too. Just tell that to your HOA. This is a yard that is not being kept up, but every plant in this landscape is a non-native plant. This is Norway maple. So, it's a mess, but it's not a mess because of the species that are there. It's a mess because nobody's taking care of it. This is a 100% native plant, except for our little patch of lawn here. This is Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. It's beautiful. An HOA would never cite her for this. They wouldn't know that they're native plants because they're beautiful. So using lawn as a cue for care, as a good model to show that, yeah, we can have more plants in our landscapes without it being wild and messy, is the best way to convince your HOA that it's okay to use these natives. Question 23. I have a small property. Should I plant several individuals of a few species, or should I try to squeeze as much diversity onto the property as possible, but only have one or two individuals of each species? That is a really good question. And it depends on what you're trying to plant these natives for. What's this restoration directed at? Let's say we want to support the monarch. Well, having one or two individuals of milkweed is not the way to go if you're trying to support a monarch, because just 2 or 3 caterpillars will strip these plants and it won't be enough resource for them. So having a big patch like this will be enough for all the monarchs that you're ever going to have. That's bunching. That's massing that's required to support that particular target insect. What if you're trying to support pollinators? Here's black-eyed Susan. Let's say you're a specialist pollinator on black-eyed Susan. You want to make it as convenient as possible. So the bee doesn't have to go far to move from flower to flower. Foraging can be really efficient and it can reproduce quickly. If it had to fly 200 yards between each plant to find one, it would be much more difficult to get the resources that it needs. So on a small property, it's probably better to aggregate a few species, use higher numbers, higher abundance of a few species, then get a few individuals of many species. But this is where you can form a neighborhood group where you're targeting a lot of different species, but you're going to use a lot more properties to do it. You're seeking diversity through your neighbors, and you can also build community doing that. Question 24, why do you want us to keep our leaves on our property? Oh, there's so many reasons. Like, leaves protect the soil moisture of our soil community. They're returning nutrients to the soil, and they're providing habitat. Those are 3 good ones. Remember, there are more species that live in the soil than above the soil. It's an extremely diverse ecosystem. And most of the species are detritivores. They are breaking down the leaf litter, returning the nutrients to the soil so that the tree can use them again the next year. If you look at a square meter of healthy leaf litter, there are probably 250,000 mites, 100,000 springtails, 90,000 proturans. Those are very primitive insects. Really takes a microscope to see them well. 1 million nematodes. It is a thriving ecosystem, and all of that is in that leaf litter. And when you rake it away, none of that is in that leaf litter. There are beautiful butterflies that depend on leaf litter, like the banded hairstreak. Its caterpillars eat oak leaf litter. There could be a caterpillar down there. You would never see it when you're raking away, and you lose that beautiful species, and several other lycaenids as well. There are 70 species of moths that we call litter moths, like the ambiguous litter moth, or the American idea, or the dark-spotted pauthis. They're all living in leaf litter unless we rake it away. And then you've got the predators that eat all of those things. Several species of ground beetles. How about the fireflies? This is an adult firefly. It's not a fly at all. It's a beetle. It's not a bug either if we call it a lightning bug. There's its luminescent organ. But this is what the larva looks like. It is a predator in leaf litter, where it's eating arthropods, worms, and snails and slugs. If we rake away the leaf litter, we lose our fireflies. And of course, there's many birds, like our flickers here, that are depending on all of that life that is in the leaf litter under our trees. So those are the reasons that I try to encourage people to keep leaf litter on the property. Where should you do it? You want to put it under the trees as much as you can. So this is just a neighbor. A lot of these plants are not native plants, but he's got the idea of having beds around his trees. The bigger the bed, the better, and that is where your leaves should go. I did a homestay somewhere. I don't remember where I was, but I took this picture because these people simply put a little rock divider here, and they put a lot of leaves in here. It's one way of keeping leaves in a fairly neat way in your yard. But won't the leaves bury my plants? Well, when I hear that, I always wonder who was raking the leaves before we got here. And we did have plants. So somehow those plants must be able to get through normal leaf litter. This is trout lily coming right through the leaf litter. No problem at all. Nobody raked it. This is at my house. This is wood poppy coming through the leaf litter. I don't rake my leaf litter for two reasons. I'm not home to do it, and I want it to stay where it is. So this is what it looks like in the spring. It's just starting, and here it is a few weeks later, coming right through the leaf litter, no problem at all. These wonderful spring ephemeral beds that you see at places like Mount Cuba Center. There's a leaf litter base on all of these things. Here's Virginia creeper with a leaf litter base acting as a ground cover. It just goes right over it. Golden seal right over it. Put in your wild ginger and your May apples and your foam flower and your ferns all over a base of leaf litter. Which is then being decomposed by all those insects we mentioned. This is a wonderful way to support your tree. It will love it. And also all the moths that fall out of that tree can pupate very nicely in this setting. Here's a layered landscape. It doesn't, all ground covers don't have to be 2 inches high. All of these can be considered a ground cover. And again, the leaf litter is right down there. Can I mulch my leaves? Well, you can, but what you're doing is mulching all those insects I just talked about too, including your fireflies. You're grinding them all up. So the real question is, why do you need to mulch it? You do not need to mulch your leaves. It will shorten their functional lifespan. You never want to have bare soil. So if mulching your leaves leaves the soil bare by the end of August, not a good idea. People do it because it looks nicer, I know, but I don't know. We've got to put functionality before aesthetics one of these days. Question 28, do cultivars of native plants have the same ecological value as their parent species? Well, it depends on the trait that was selected for. So this is a common question. We looked at six traits, ones that of woody plants, ones that enhance fall color and leaf variegation, change of growth habit, disease resistance, enhanced fruiting, changing a green leaf to red or purple. The only one that had a impact on insects was changing a green leaf to red or purple, because that loads the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. And I know we love our red leaf cultivars, but I would suggest avoiding them. Double flowers, of course, remove all of the benefits for pollinators. You're taking the anthers and all the reproductive parts of the flowers, and it ends up turning them into petals, and then you end up having no nectar and no pollen for our pollinators. Mount Cuba Center, I mentioned this a couple of times in this talk. They're doing a number of very nice comparisons in trial gardens. So I would go to this website, go to their website and look at their results, because they're very good at posting them. They've tested a lot of perennial plants in terms of whether they're good or bad as cultivars. Okay, question 29. This is our last question. And I've debated whether or not to include it, but I'm going to include it this time. I know this is very personal, but I'm dying to know what your religious views are. Well, first, let's talk about my religious history. I was baptized a Presbyterian. I was raised as a Methodist. My first marriage was into a Greek Orthodox family. My second marriage to Cindy was in a Quaker meeting house. So I've kind of been around the religious block at this point. I think about it all the time, and my views are always changing. But let me first talk about what I don't believe in. I do not believe that every species on Earth was put here for humans to exploit. I do not believe it is God's will to destroy the world as we know it and to use humans as his agents of destruction. I do not believe he's pleased when we cut down 2,000-year-old redwoods so we can make frivolous lawn furniture. And I do not believe that when we level a boreal forest to make magazine inserts or toilet paper, that he's very pleased. Or when we shoot the most numerous bird on the planet to oblivion for fun. I'm talking about the passenger pigeon. What do I believe? Well, I'm starting to see an awful lot of similarities between today's major religions and the beliefs of the ancients that we came from. And here are some of them. God created man and beast and all the fishes in the sea. That's a common theme. God laid down a number of basic rules, commandments that we have to follow to remain in his good graces. God is forgiving when we seek forgiveness. So what if we deified nature the way the ancients did? Let's call her Mother Nature and look at each one of these conditions that our modern religions have. Did Mother Nature create humans? Are there rules we must follow to remain in nature's good graces? Does nature promise eternal life for believers? Well, scientists long ago reached the consensus that yes, humans are products of natural selection. They're a product of nature. So yes, Mother Nature created humans. Are there basic rules we have to follow to remain in Mother Nature's good graces? Absolutely. If we overexploit the ecosystems that provide our life support, in other words, the products from nature that we call ecosystem services, those ecosystems are going to collapse and we're going to lose those services. If we harvest fish faster than those fish can reproduce, the fisheries collapse. And we're talking about the Atlantic cod, Alaska's halibut, snow crab, and red king crabs, Pacific salmon, orange roughy. So many times we've overfished our fisheries. When we shoot all the passenger pigeons and the dodos and the stellar sea cows and the great auks and the Alaskan curlews and the Carolina parakeets, American bison, and others, those creatures either go extinct or they become functionally extinct and we no longer get meat from them. If we kill off our pollinators, we lose pollinator services. If we chop down the Earth's forests, we lose the lungs and climate control of the planet. If we pollute our atmosphere with carbon dioxide, we suffer the ravages of climate change. If we pave over our watersheds, we get washed away in floods. If we remove water from our aquifers and rivers faster than it can be replaced by rain, our rivers no longer reach the sea. The Great Salt Lake becomes a mudflat. The Aral Sea dries up entirely. That's what you're looking at here. And our aquifers provide sand instead of water. It's nature who's in control on this planet. We are not. And if we don't play by her rules, she's going to smite us, as it were. So the ancients understood all this, and they lived the best they could within the constraints of Mother Nature. And when they didn't, their societies collapsed. What about the promise of eternal life for believers? Well, our kids, our grandkids, our great-grandkids, our cousins, our nieces, our nephews, they're all carrying our genes forward into future generations. And as long as our lineage respects the laws of nature, we get to reproduce those genes well into the future. Is nature forgiving? Nature's enormously forgiving. It's resilient. This used to be a cornfield. This is the Nachusa grasslands in Illinois. 750 species of plants there, 180 bird species living there. Didn't take long to recover from a cornfield. So nature is forgiving, but it's not endlessly forgiving. There are limits to her ability to rebuild ecosystems. And the easiest limit to understand is extinction. Mother Nature is not going to forgive us for condemning one or more of her creations to extinction. It and its contributions to our life support are lost forever. Keep this in mind when you remember that the UN is predicting we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. So what do I believe? I believe the ancients had it right. I really do. What sustains us day to day is the natural world right here on Earth. The ancients' beliefs did not come about by accidents. They were products of natural selection. Those who treated the natural systems that supported them with care and respect thrived. Those who overexploited them for short-term personal gain did not. So whether or not we deify nature today, I believe we need to show her reverence as if we did. That's all I have. Thanks very much.
Great. Okay, we do have a couple of questions. The first one is, are there any oaks that aren't susceptible to the things that are killing oaks?
Yes. In every species of oak, there are resistant individuals. And that's, that's good news. So that includes sudden oak death syndrome, all of the really nasty guys. They're killing a good percentage of our oaks, but there's some percentage, and sometimes it's 20% or more that have good resistance. Those are going to be the future of our oak forests. And the blue jays are helping us in that regard, because when they move acorns around, they pick them up and weigh them. So first of all, the really sick trees don't make any acorns, but the ones that are not quite as healthy, they make small and lightweight acorns. The jays pick up the heaviest ones and take them away. So that what they're doing is propagating, and then they tap them below the soil surface. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So they're actually planting resistant genotypes that will carry forth into the future.
The next question is, what about the moths who love kale?
The moths that love kale. I think it's called the green stripe something. Yeah, aren't they cute? What about them? Well, we are competing with the things that eat our agricultural products because we want them. So, I'm not saying shouldn't have any agriculture. You've got to control them in the best way you can. But for the most part, our biggest agricultural pests, things like the cabbage white butterfly, are introduced pests themselves. They're invasive species that don't have a lot of natural enemies. But yeah, there's a conflict, and that's of course why we have insecticides. It's why the whole field of entomology was created, was to fight insect pests in agriculture.
And that was our last question.
Oh, okay, good, because I didn't know how to answer it.
Oh, no, one more. Something else just popped up. Excellent webinar. You were able to give a lot of information in bite-sized, easy to understand pieces. So thank you for that. I didn't realize the black and orange insects were coded to tell the world they taste bad. Who are their predators?
Well, nothing eats them. But if they were green, it would be mostly birds. Birds love green, hairless caterpillars, things in the family Geometridae. That's their favorite food. Actually, I shouldn't say that. There are a ton of insect predators that eat other insects, and they're doing it all the time. Hymenopteran predators and assassin bugs and predatory stink bugs and so on.
Okay, we got one comment here at the end. I'm a convert to the Church of Tallamy. Thank you so much.
That's not my church. Okay, thank you.
Oh, we had another one just pop up. What would be some good pollinator plants for a pollinator strip?
It depends on where you live, but the best way to create a pollinator garden is to focus on the plants that support specialist pollinators. So we have almost 4,000 species of native bees. A third of them can only reproduce in the pollen of particular plants. So if we plant those plants, the generalist bees can use those plants as well. So in the East, particularly the Northeast, Massachusetts, for example, goldenrod would be probably the best plant you could put in. It supports about 12 species of specialist bees, followed by native asters, supports 11 species, something like that. Our perennial sunflowers, anything in the genus Helianthus, is very high in terms of specialist bees. If you have those 3 genera in your yard, you can support up to 40 species of specialist bees. And the generalist bees, like our honeybees and our bumblebees and many other native bees, can use those plants as well.
All right, I think, oh, another one just popped up. I live on the ocean. Which pollinators can I support best and with which plants?
You should use seaside goldenrod. I think it's the prettiest of our goldenrods, and it's adapted to high salt, and it does really well. So that's a great one. Monarchs migrate right down the coast. So those fall blooming asters are really important to fuel that monarch migration. that's, happens start from late August on down. Baccharis, I forget its common name. But it's a shrub that does well. And of course, our myrtles, wax myrtle, is another great plant. All of these things are flowering plants, and they're helping pollinators. You do not need big showy flowers to help pollinators. American holly is an important plant, particularly in our coastal plain areas along the shore. Their flowers are tiny little yellow things, but they're magnets for native bees. They're all over them when they're in bloom, even though they're not very pretty for us.
And somebody just chimed in, it's groundsel bush.
Brown, so I was going to say that, but I wasn't sure. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay. And then another one just popped up. What kind of asters?
New York aster, New England aster. Those are two that are popping into mind.
Okay, great. I think we've come to the end of our questions. You're getting lots of hearts floating up the screen, you see. Yes, so thank you very much. That was very informative.
All right. Well, thanks. Good luck, everybody.
Thanks everybody for coming, and we hope that you'll join us tomorrow when we have Blue Stem Natives building a sustainable garden. And then I hope you'll also join us on Saturday at Kennedy's Country Gardens when we have our live expo. So thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.